Thank you for coming out. I'm Peter Johnson-Staub. I'm the Assistant Town Manager. We do have a bunch of seats up front for those who are still looking for a seat. We are going to be talking tonight about a study that has been funded by the Coastal Zone Management of the feasibility of beach and dune nourishment for Surf Drive. How can we possibly protect Surf Drive from storms and sea level rise? And the presentation will be given by Connor Ofston of the Woods Hole Group. Before I get started, I would like to mention that Select Board Member Heather Goldstone has joined us here tonight. However, we're going to ask that you direct questions to our consultant and to town staff. Mike Renshaw, Town Manager, is with us this evening as well, and your new Coastal Resilience Specialist, Josh Wrigley, is here as well. And Select Board Member Bob Mascali is still here, although I wasn't sure he would be. Thank you, Bob. So we are going to, there's quite a bit of content that we do want to cover tonight. So is it about 30 minutes, Connor, that the presentation? 35 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for questions. So we do ask you hold your questions to the end and come up to this microphone for those questions.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Connor Ofston. I am just setting this up on Zoom so I can share for all the folks there. All right. Okay, thank you so much for being here. This is a great turnout. My name is Connor Ofston again. I'm a coastal scientist at Woods Hole Group. We are here with the town and CZM. I will jump right into what our project team is. So the Town of Falmouth is led by Peter Johnson-Staub for this project, so thank you for him meeting with us regularly every other week for the past 8 months. We're also joined by Mike Renshaw, Town Manager, Peter McConerty of DPW, Josh Wrigley, Coastal Resiliency Specialist from the town, as well as others. Our funder is the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management. We have representation from Rebecca Haney here today, so thank you, Rebecca, for coming. At the end of the presentation, you can direct questions to the whole of the project team if you like, but I'll take the first of it. And then as well with Woods Hole Group, I'm Connor Ofston, the project manager. I'm joined here by Leslie Fields, the project advisor. We might have a couple other staff coming in and out as possible. So this is the Surf Drive Beach and Dune Nourishment Feasibility Study. What is beach and dune nourishment? Beach nourishment is bringing in sand, gravel, sometimes cobble, just bringing sediment to the beach to build its volume, to build it wider, to build it higher, to improve the habitat, to improve the protection that it might bring in the face of storms. The same essentially goes for dune restoration. Dune restoration is bringing in sediment compatible with dunes to build slopes, to attain certain crest elevations that can build a dune that both provides the habitat that dune can provide, but also provides the storm buffer that it can provide to assets on the landward side, in this case, Surf Drive. So we're looking at beach and dune nourishment and evaluating its feasibility. Thank you. What that means is we're going to evaluate, can we build this? We're looking at all of the different constraints of the site, the topography, the wetlands, the eelgrass, the flood risk. We're also looking at the performance of a design. So we've done some modeling that I'll present here. If we design a beach or dune nourishment project, can it stand up to storms of some level? What is the longevity? And then we're also looking at feasibility from the lens of engineering and permitting. You know, what does the design look like? What do the regulators think of this? Does this pass the Wetlands Protection Act? I've also got some slides here on cost as well. So those are all the aspects of feasibility that we'll be looking at. The intended outcomes of the project, so what we were kind of striving for in any sort of design, are threefold. The first things why we're here is we're trying to combat beach erosion, beach and dune erosion. We're trying to reduce wave overtopping. So that picture there on the right-hand side was from January 2024, and it's just a perfect example of what we're trying to prevent happening to Surf Drive, or at least reduce the risk of happening. So oftentimes a storm will come, it will wash over the beach, over the dunes, carries sand into the roadway that needs to be maintained by DPW. Sometimes the roadway may be undermined. Underneath the roadway are utilities that can become vulnerable. And there's also the loss of beach habitat and the loss of beach recreation that comes with that erosion. But additionally, we want to support shorebirds and native vegetation. There's a lot of very valuable natural resources here. The beach and dune of Surf Drive are kind of a staple in the town of Falmouth. This is the longest part of their shoreline, and that natural resource is really important. There's also recreational resources. There's public beach, there's private beach, there's many ways for people to access this coastline. There's the roadway itself, which provides great views. So we want to understand all of those kind of mechanisms. So I'll quickly go through kind of how we got here. Many of you may have been part of the planning processes in the past. There are a few reports. There's a climate change vulnerability assessment for the whole town of Falmouth. That climate change vulnerability assessment found Surf Drive to be especially vulnerable and especially critical to the town. So they then did a coastal resiliency report, looking at Surf Drive and really understanding what's at risk, looking at erosion, looking at flooding, inventorying all the assets, and trying to develop kind of from a grand scheme of things, what are we going to do? Because there are significant coastal hazards here. There is coastal erosion. Some of this beach is very narrow as a result of erosion. Some of the dunes have essentially been lost, and now there's very little vegetation along the edge of the road. There's also extreme storms, which bring storm surge and overwash of the beach. This map here on the top is showing the probability of flooding on an annual basis in 2008. So since 2008, there has been some degree of sea level rise, so these are almost even old projections at this point. We have future projections as well that I'm happy to talk to. But in 2008, the road is expected to flood even once a year. Any area that is covered in dark blue has a 100% annual chance of flooding. So the condition has been severe for some time. For decades, Falmouth has been managing their sediment, managing their roadways, and having to deal with these issues. With sea level rise, all of these issues are expected to worsen. So sea level rise is really only going in one direction, and those higher water levels are going to bring high tide flooding at some point. They're going to bring higher level storms, more surge, more overtopping of the roadway. So this is a video just to give a brief picture of what can happen when a storm hits Surf Drive. So we're pictured here right at the edge of Salt Pond. That's the inlet there. Waves are rushing up and over the beach and flooding into Salt Pond. There's lots of sand being washed all over the place. There's some debris. And this is a storm in January 13th that, on the scheme of things, was not a very large storm. So trying to compare what that January 13th storm was, it amounts, the water level amounted to about a 4-year, 5-year storm. So we can expect that water level to occur every 4 or 5 years. That is in January 2024, pictured on the far right there. And it amounts to something about a half foot less than Hurricane Sandy, about a foot and a half less than Hurricane Bob, far less than Hurricane Carol or the 1938 hurricanes, which washed over these beaches. This was a particularly damaging event because the significant wave height was high, especially off in Buzzards Bay and other areas. It really depends storm by storm what areas of the beach are affected, what towns get affected most. But there were large waves, but they didn't coincide exactly with the high tide or the peak of the storm surge water level. So this storm could have been worse than it was, but in any case, what was a 4 to 5 year storm amounted to a significant amount of damage to the roadway. So just quickly, those past studies that I've mentioned, there's the climate change vulnerability assessment, the coastal resiliency planning report for Surf Drive. These are all available on the town's website. Out of that came a pathway of a management pathway. This is a simplified version of it here, but it's essentially saying that in the near term, the town of Falmouth, through a public outreach process, came to the conclusion that beach and dune restoration is their priority to try to do right now. This is maybe the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest way to try to build up the barrier beach. We're working here on a barrier beach. That means we are on shifting sands at all times, and the erosion that's happening, the first fix to that is, well, we might need more sand. So beach and dune restoration is what's looked at first. At the same time, DPW continues to maintain the roadway. Public outreach is ongoing. But in the long term, with sea level rise, it's going to become someday untenable to maintain Surf Drive. The beach itself may be able to stick around, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the infrastructure that's there and planting our flag at the edge of the ocean is going to be increasingly difficult to maintain. I'll quickly go over just some of our survey results. So our project reach is from Trunk River in the southwest to Shore Street in the east. It's about a 1.5 mile reach. We cover the Shining Sea Bikeway to some extent, the transition to Surf Drive and Elm Road and Mills Ave, the public beach itself. So we're looking along this whole reach that has varying conditions. So we wanted to map out those varying conditions. We did a wetland resource delineation. We did a topographic survey. We did an eelgrass survey. We sampled sediment. We mapped all of the infrastructure, edge of road, all the buildings and jetties and so forth, all to set the baseline for analysis. Real quickly, the wetlands resource delineation came back fairly unsurprisingly as that this area is coastal beach and coastal dune. But one thing that's worth noting in this hashed area, it is a barrier beach. And I've been using that term. A barrier beach is a land bridge built by sediment. So it's, there's no foundation to it in terms of bedrock. It's always able to shift. This was built by uncompacted sediment, moving by waves and currents, and forming a barrier in front of inland embayments, such as Oyster Pond and Salt Pond, Fresh Pond, and Sitter's Pond upstream. Here are a few pictures of the surf drive that you all know very well, but just to say that the conditions change from reach to reach. On the southwest side, we have Trunk River. That's backed in some cases by a revetment. The beach itself is a bit coarser. There can be gravel and cobble. As we move up the coastline to the area of Elm Road or Moores Beach, the beach is very low and narrow. There exists a small dune at the back, upper beach, and the roadway is incredibly low. Then moving further east to the public beach area, we have the Mitchell Bathhouse. We have a bit of a wider beach in certain areas, like the cottages are actually one of the more stable of the reaches here. And we have some existing dunes that are providing a level of protection. The sediment cover is varying across the reach. Generally, from west to east, we go from coarse material to finer material. So by Trunk River in the southwest, there are materials such as gravels and cobbles, pictured here in the upper left. Gravel and cobble responds differently to storm waves. So while sand might get eroded and become a nearshore sandbar, cobble can get pushed upland and inland and create a storm berm. Then we have mixed grain sediment. As we move east, then more sand mixed among a few cobbles and shells, and then some patches of the beach are pure sand. So all of this was sampled and is taken into account as we talk to regulators and perform our modeling and design potential adaptation strategies. One last thing to note about the existing conditions are the amount of assets and infrastructure along Surf Drive. We have the roadway itself. We have the Shining Sea Bikeway. We have a significant amount of utilities. For instance, under Surf Drive, there's a water main. Underneath the Shining Sea Bikeway is a sewer main. There are private cottages. There are public buildings like the Mitchell Bathhouse. There are overhead utilities, electrical substations. And then, of course, there's natural resources, which bring their own value. So what I want to start with are some of the constraints that we ran into as we were thinking about designing a beach and dune restoration project. One of the most significant ones is the existing topography. And it doesn't take a survey to know that Surf Drive is very low lying. But now we know exactly how low it is lying. And the lowest points are about 5 feet NAVD, maybe 5 to 6 feet NAVD, which mean they're about 5 feet above mean sea level, maybe 3 to 4 feet above the high tide line. The beach between the ocean and that low surf drive, in many cases, is very narrow. This transect here is showing just west of Salt Pond Inlet, a transect that is, the roadway is at about 5 or 6 feet NAVD, and the beach essentially just slopes directly grading down from the edge of road and into the ocean. It's a very flat beach. There's very little volume. There used to be, in some cases, more dune here, but they've eroded over time. So as we look to design a beach or dune nourishment project, we're really limited by the amount of beach width, dunes specifically. A dune performs best when there's a big, wide, dry beach in front of it. You know, dunes are really only meant to engage with the ocean during those peak storm events. But here, if there is a dune placed on the back of this beach, it's going to be so close to the ocean that it is washed and engaging with the water, even during low-level storms. Another constraint to be aware of is protected species. So I'm sure many people are well aware of the piping plover population, the least tern population. These are both protected shorebird species along Surf Drive. They may even be, I should know this actually, we're going to talk to Mass Audubon and find out what they're doing right now. You know, I was just in Westport the other day and there's a piping plover nest sitting on their beach. Right now, they're forming new nests. Thank you, Peter. So piping plovers are there annually. Least terns are there annually. The number of ests, the number of nests, the number of mating pairs changes from year to year, but there's a consistent presence. And their locations of nesting can shift as well. Secondly, and something that was a bit more new to us, was the identification of rare plant species that exist typically in overwash areas. So there is the salt pond pennywort and the sea beach knotweed. These species are all vulnerable to a potential engineering project. So while coastal habitats like beach and dune are critical for their function, the process of construction and the design of a project can be negative to them and to them thriving. So piping plovers, for instance, they require a wide, flat beach. They also require certain types of sediment and tend to nest in certain types of sediment, often sometimes a little bit more coarse. But if the beach is too steep, or if the dune itself is scarped, those piping plovers cannot get up into above the high tide line. They don't have as much space to roam. They might not find a place that they consider safe for nesting. The protected plant species as well. A beach and dune nourishment project could potentially smother them, and that could be a taking, or it could require mitigation. The last constraint that I want to mention is eelgrass, and this one kind of comes as a double-edged sword. So eelgrass is very prolific off of Surf Drive, and that's unique to Surf Drive. So again, referencing Westport, just because I was there this weekend, they don't have any eelgrass essentially mapped off of their beach, and their beaches are eroding quickly, especially one called East Beach. Surf Drive has enjoyed relative stability over the years. There is erosion, there's volume loss that I've already mentioned. The dunes that are there are not very robust, but there's some areas that have enjoyed some stability. One is the area near the cottages. You can see that there's a slight bend out towards the ocean where that beach is a bit wider. And that can be a result of eelgrass. The rooting system of eelgrass tends to hold sediment in place. It helps to reduce and become friction for wave energy and can help protect Surf Drive. But also, because the eelgrass is there, eelgrass is a protected habitat. It's essential fish habitat. And the Massachusetts Department of Marine Fisheries protects that habitat. They don't allow beach nourishment, which would smother it. If you smothered it with sand, it would die out and it may not grow back, or it may take years. So Massachusetts Department of Marine Fisheries wants a buffer between any project, engineering project, and its eelgrass. Now, oftentimes that may not be a concern, but here the eelgrass comes up very near the shore. We were out surveying in a boat. We had a video camera under the water, thanks to the harbor master who lent us that boat. But we couldn't even get inshore enough to map all of the eelgrass, so we had to go back on foot and wade out into the water to find out and map where the edge of eelgrass was. So in some cases, it was as near as even 40 feet from the high tide line. Because of that eelgrass, we had to remove beach nourishment from consideration of this project. That 50-foot buffer, even a 100-foot buffer from eelgrass finds its way onto Surf Drive Beach and even the roadway in some cases. So any beach nourishment project that we would propose would have impacted that eelgrass and is not feasible. So beach nourishment is one alternative that many people do. These are different pictures from Sandwich or Duxbury where beach nourishment has been used to improve the coastal resiliency of a barrier beach. But in the case of Surf Drive, we had to reject this alternative. Another thing to mention is that hard armoring is rejected from consideration in this project. Now, that was coming out of the town's planning projects. Beach and dune nourishment were identified as the primary first response to issues of vulnerability along Surf Drive. But there are other reasons to reject hard armoring from a solution. Here we're looking at breakwaters. This is a seawall, and these are groins. Seawalls in particular are a very appealing solution. You know, we look at Surf Drive and we say, hey, Surf Drive is being undermined. It's being washed over by waves. Can't we just put a wall there and hold it where it is? And that sounds like the right solution, but there are negative cascading effects of a seawall. Seawalls can cause reflection of waves. And while that reflection of waves is moving away from Surf Drive, it then is driven into the ground right at the beach at its toe. So there's significant erosion right at the toe of all seawalls, unless there's scour protection that's built in. But again, there are beaches that essentially erode and drop in elevation. You're trying to protect what's landward of the seawall, but anything seaward is just given up on. So the beaches of Surf Drive, if a seawall were constructed, would essentially be lost in time. Once that beach is lost, you've now dropped your elevation in front of the toe of the seawall, and now waves, instead of breaking on sandbars or breaking on the beach, are now breaking right on your seawall. And so that wave forcing is able to cause damage, to overtop, and cause flooding still that you had tried to avoid in the first place. So this picture along Marshfield is showing a seawall that's crumbling in the face of storm waves and nor'easters. The sidewalk and the patios are buckling, the seawall itself is crumbling, and the beach is barely there, even at a low tide. Another consideration is breakwaters. So why aren't we considering breakwaters here? Breakwaters are intended to break wave energy. They're intended to deposit sediment on their landward side. But breakwaters don't have any effect on the storm surge water level. They don't have any effect on sea level rise. So that map that I showed you earlier about flooding and an annual chance of flooding on Surf Drive, that stands regardless of if a breakwater is built. These breakwaters could break wave energy, but the long-term prospect of Surf Drive is flooding because the elevation is low. Lastly, I do have groins pictured here. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but these groins are pictured on Surf Drive. There are already groins there. Those are intended to capture the longshore transport of sediment. And this picture is just to demonstrate that despite the presence of hard armoring, despite the presence of groins, the beaches are still very narrow. Okay, so moving on to some more hopeful news though, I want to talk about opportunities for restoration. Now, we looked at all these constraints and existing conditions and then started to think of what are our conceptual engineering solutions. First, we're looking at no action. We always want to look at no action because it's a major investment to go out and do something. And we want to try to have a baseline to compare against. Secondly, we are looking at dune restoration, attempting to maximize as much sand as we can get into the system as possible without impacting the roadway, without impacting the resources. How much sand can we put at that upper beach to build elevation, to build volume? Again, what Surf Drive needs, what a barrier beach needs, is sand to be able to withstand the brunt of storm waves. Third, we're looking at targeted improvements, more of a management technique than an engineering technique. It's essentially taking alternative 2 and placing it where the vulnerability is greatest. So instead of nourishing or restoring the dunes along the 1.5-mile stretch, well, there are some areas that are more vulnerable than others, some areas that are lacking dune more than others. So to maximize the benefit of the town's resources, maybe we restore dunes only in those certain places. The fourth alternative is a managed retreat and phased adaptation approach. There are, when I say phased adaptation, that means we're not saying abandon surf drive outright, rip the Band-Aid off all at once. There need to be steps to that. One of those steps could be letter A there, removing the seaward lane of surf drive. If you remove the seaward lane of surf drive, you create more space, more beach space to build a dune. So in that 4A, we've designed a dune that's maximized. It's as big, as wide, as tall as it can possibly be, while still meeting ecological constraints. And we modeled that to see, is there a greater benefit to doing so? Lastly, 4B, which will come later, there is the consideration of removing both lanes of surf drive, converting this road to an oversand vehicle access roadway. All right, as I walk through engineering alternatives, we're really just going to focus, for the purposes of this presentation, on this reach B, we're calling Moores Beach. It's a long reach from the Shining Sea Bikeway to Elm Road. We do have results that will be in a public report on June 30th that show a trunk river reach, show the cottages, show the public beach as well. But Moores Beach is really a good poster child for this because it's the lowest and the most vulnerable at the moment. Just for the purposes of understanding all of these alternatives and with respect to the baseline, this is what it looks like today. This is the no action alternative. There's very little dune. There's some pockets of existing dune. There's some revetment where the road comes as close as possible to the edge of the water line. But the roadway again the beach again is narrow. This is a profile of that. So we're looking at the elevation of Surf Drive and the beach. You can see that Surf Drive is at about 5 feet NAVD. There's a little ridge of a dune. And then we have the slope down into the near shore, gently sloping. Eelgrass is offshore, about 160 feet off. Alternative number 2 is the maximized dune restoration. So not impacting the roadway. Looking at the conditions as they are today, what can we build? This is what the footprint of that dune could look like. So we're pushing that dune out, but putting as much sand in the system as we can, out on the upper beach, planting it with native vegetation. In the case of plantings, it would typically be American beach grass. Other native plants could take hold in time from there. And this is that in profile view. So you can see that dune over the existing condition gives us about 2 more feet of elevation. 2 feet is not too much, but as we'll see in the slides about modeling, it's better than nothing. So we would slope this dune from the edge of the roadway up to a crest elevation of 7 or 8 feet, and then we would slope it gently into the near shore and tie in with the beach. This is alternative 3. Let me get that out the way. Okay. This is alternative 3, the targeted improvements. So that same dune design could be applied across the entire reach, as we have it in alternative 2, or it could be applied at the areas that need it most. So what those areas are, along the trunk river reach, the revetment ends. It stops short of reaching Surf Drive. So this long gap here, about 500 feet or so, has no existing revetment. It has little protection. There is some dune that exists there, but again, it could be more. So we're proposing restoring the dune there, burying even a cobble berm underneath it because that is compatible, as I said, with the sediment along Trunk River. Then we have a vegetated dune proposed along Moores Field, up to Salt Pond. The cottages are a gap in that proposed dune because that area contains existing dune. The beach is the widest. It's a bit less vulnerable. There's a gap at the base of Mills Ave where dune could be restored. The public beach has some existing dune. And then again, dune is needed in front of the parking lot and the Mitchell Bathhouse. Alternative 4A, this is that attempt to build as big a dune as we can. So again, if we dropped a lane of Surf Drive, we would gain about 15 feet horizontally within which we could build another dune. So that's what this is showing. You can see that the footprint of the dune has increased in width by about 15 feet. Because we're going wider, we can also go higher. So those slopes on the back edge and the foreslope of the dune can now meet at a higher peak in the middle. So if 15 feet of Surf Drive were given up for a dune restoration project, we can now build a dune that has a bit more volume to it. And it reaches a higher elevation of about 8 or 9 feet NAVD. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the modeling that we did here. I think it's here. Thanks, Peter. So when I talk about modeling, what we used here was a model called X-Beach. X-Beach is a cross-shore model that sends waves and storm surge up the beach and down the beach. We have tidal cycles during that period. We can see the sediment moving onshore, moving offshore, and shifting with the varying energies of the waves. I'm going to show you 3 different images stacked on top of each other here. We'll start with the existing conditions. All of these are changes to the beach profile in response to a 5-year storm. So that is a relatively low intensity storm, one that we would be expected to occur, again, every 5 years. The 2 pieces I want you to focus on in this figure are the black line with the tan fill underneath. That's the existing profile. So we are at Transect B, we're at Moores Beach again. This is that existing profile. And the red line is the post-storm profile. So the storm has come through in this case, and it has eroded the beach. It's also eroded the roadway and undermined it. You can see that the beach has dropped by about 3 feet, 2 to 3 feet, and the roadway itself has dropped by about 1 to 2 feet. That sand, in this case, is mostly being pushed inland. So it's becoming overwash. Essentially, the biggest takeaways from this are 5-year storm can very easily undermine the roadway and erode the beach. Now, what if we built that dune restoration? We're maximizing as much sand as we can in the existing upper beach. Again, it's not a large project, but it is better than nothing. And what is the result that we have? So our black line here is the proposed profile. You can see as we compare it to the existing that there is a peak now at about 7 feet above mean sea level. And that's the crest of the dune, which then slopes down into the beach. And then we gain back the existing profile offshore. So that is now a taller dune, more sand, and we run a 5-year storm against it. And that red line is the result. And you can compare the red lines of the upper one to the lower one and see that we do have beach erosion in both cases, but we don't have roadway undermining in the second case. The elevation of the roadway stays the same. We don't expect that that there would be damage to it. So under a small-scale storm, a small-scale project can provide a benefit. Lastly, we have the alternative 4A, which is the maximized beach dune restoration project. If we give up 15 feet of Surf Drive, if we build ourselves a wider and higher dune, how much more protection is gained? So we run that same storm, a 5-year storm against it, and we can see that that dune, now bigger, is still washed away. But not all of that sand is lost. Instead of washing into Salt Pond, it's washed, in some cases, to the near shore. The beach is still maintained. So instead of a scarp here at the edge of the roadway, we still have a wide and dry beach above high tide. So building a larger project means that you could protect your beach longer and you could protect your roadway longer. It also means, though, that any project that we build is likely to be washed out in time These are all temporary solutions. The town can invest in re-upping their permits, reconstructing these projects, and we'll talk about costs in a minute. Or we'll talk about cost right now. So, we don't have a cost to alternative one. Alternative one is no action. So there's no construction cost. But there is a maintenance cost. There is a damage cost. And we're still working on calculating what that is. We're putting a value to all the assets, trying to identify when they're damaged and what that costs. And it's looking to be a high number. So the consequences of no action are one thing that we're quantifying and will be in the final report on June 30th. Now, to take action, to construct alternative 2, 3, or 4A, we have these varying costs over here. Alternative 2 is based on importing sand, importing some cobble in the Trunk River case, grading that material with heavy equipment, and then planting beach grass across a really large acreage. That project would cost roughly $3 million. Alternative 3 is that same dune restoration design, but only targeting places that need it most. So again, looking at Moores Beach specifically, and maybe the base of Mills Ave. Cutting essentially the project length in half, and doing so cuts the project cost in half to about $1.5 million. Alternative 4A is shown here, which includes that dune design, very large dune design, plus the removement of pavement. So the act of retreating from Surf Drive is not free. Just the deconstruction of the roadway is very expensive, and the total cost of that project is about $6 million. And I'll note that that doesn't include managing the utilities. Again, there is a water main underneath Surf Drive. There is a sewer main underneath Surf Drive. And those are aspects that need to be taken account of too. If these projects were washed out, we would expect these costs to be about the same if the town wanted to rebuild it. So if alternative 2 were eroded and the town protected their road, they could rebuild that dune for another $3 million. If more time has passed, then inflation might increase that by a bit. Alternative 4A, the same goes except for the removal. The aspect of removal is one and done. You only need to do it once, and then you could continually reconstruct your dune project. So we're getting to the end of the presentation here. We'll take questions soon, but I do want to talk about the temporariness of all of these alternatives. So a 5-year storm is a relatively low-intensity storm. We also looked at a 20-year storm having a 5% chance of occurring every year. And this is a video of that larger alternative in the face of a 20-year storm. And the storm is building up in time, and at the 45th hour or so, it peaks, and it overwashes the dune. So high water levels, high wave events will be expected to wash out whatever project we build. We'll let it go one more time just because it moves really quickly, but you can see the sediment shifting, sometimes moving offshore. You can see the toe of the dune being scarped, and then the peak of the storm comes and overwhelms the dune. So at the end of this event, you can see that the roadway elevation has dropped by about a foot, so we expect the road to be undermined. Understanding that any project that we can build here is temporary, we're now looking further into the alternative 4B, managed retreat alternative, and we're trying to understand what does that mean. So again, I said this earlier, the Town of Falmouth is not ripping the Band-Aid off and abandoning Surf Drive anytime soon, but the possibility of that is becoming more clear, and when that happens is a matter of what storms reach us. So if the Town of Falmouth were to begin retreating from Surf Drive, they could maintain access in the interim. The pavement could be removed, and oversand vehicle access could be maintained. This is something that has been occurring along other towns in the Massachusetts coastline. My hometown, Scituate, Massachusetts, has a beach called Peggotty Beach, where there used to be a road on a barrier beach accessing homes that was on the seaward side of those homes. Slowly, nor'easters ate away at that beach and pushed that barrier into the wetlands. And that roadway was removed, it was put on the landward side of their homes, and then the pavement was removed, and it's just been changed to just oversand access in time. The reach that oversand vehicle access and managed retreat is a priority is from Shining Sea Bikeway up to Mills Ave. So, I talk about this barrier beach again. We're sitting in front of Oyster Pond and Salt Pond. The beach in front of the public beach and the dunes there and Bywater Court is less vulnerable than the roadway that we're looking at right here. So again, in terms of phases, this is phase one, would be moving towards and thinking about retreat of this reach. I don't think we need to sit on this side too long. This is just the cross section, essentially without a roadway, but maintaining access. So again, we understand that planning retreat is not something that we can do all at once. There are many pieces of that puzzle that need to be worked out. And really the biggest one is public outreach. We need to talk as a community about what that looks like. When does this happen? Do we want this? And how long is it sustainable to protect Surf Drive with these nature-based solutions that I presented earlier? So at some point, the town of Falmouth will look at its resources and think, Surf Drive is can no longer be maintained in the face of sea level rise and storms. There's many natural resources here that need to be managed, and there's a lot of infrastructure here that needs to be managed. So there's a lot of thought that needs to be put into the sewer main, for instance, and the water main. And we can test those processes. There can be modeling that's done as to what happens if you relocate the sewer main inland. What happens if you take away this water main? Can you reroute these things and still provide the utility services that are needed to the public? And then I think one of the bigger pieces of the retreat aspect is determining the triggers for adaptation. So what does it take for the town of Falmouth to recognize that Surf Drive is no longer tenable? Is it a 5-year storm, or is it another Hurricane Bob, for instance, that comes at some point, because there's always a chance that it could. It could be long in the future, or it could be next year. What is the trigger for adaptation? It's something to think through. All right, so that's my presentation. I'll take questions now. Thanks.
So I just wanted to remind folks that we have a tight window of opportunity to complete this study by the end of June. But as Connor mentioned, the town's not racing to any decisions. So this is obviously a weighty subject and a complicated one that the select board and the community will be talking about for quite some time. So starting right now, we welcome your questions, and they can be directed to the Woods Hole group. We do have Rebecca Haney here from the Coastal Zone Management State Agency, and we have other staff members as well. So we do need to use the microphones because the folks at home on the FCTV and the Zoom will not be able to hear you. So if you want to go ahead and queue up at this microphone with your questions. Thank you.
Restoration. Are you just going to put sand down? You're not going to put any revetments underneath it for practice? I mean, I have a picture of Surf Drive here that shows the road being washed out in one section where there do I have to start over, Peter?
Go ahead.
So this last photo that you're showing, if you look down there, you're going to see a lot of rocks that were originally put down along the inside of the road. Coming forward to that, towards the edge of the picture, you can see where the road's starting to wash away. Is there a plan to revet that kind of thing, and then when you build a dune, have rocks underneath it or some sort of, by the way, those groins that are up there, we'd be happy to offer those rocks up at any time you'd like, and use them to do that particular project. But I don't see the value in just piling sand on top of sand. Is there going to be some sort of something under there that's going to hold it in place?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. No, there would not be a revetment built underneath. So I've talked a little bit about how that hard armoring can have negative consequences. Any action there has a reaction downstream from there. We might be locking sediment in the barrier to the detriment of areas that have that the longshore transport would otherwise be bringing that sediment to. So if you tried to preserve your beach here, your parcel there, and you hold onto that sand, the sand is then not stolen is the wrong word, but withheld from where it would have otherwise been going. But there are things that you can do in the core of a dune. I think Trunk River provides us with the best opportunity because of the presence of cobble and gravel. We can use larger diameter sediment. And I think that it may be possible to do that further along the beach as well through the engineering and permitting process that could be explored. So putting in a cobble core to a dune can provide more of a last line of defense. It stands up a bit more to those waves, but again, it is all unconsolidated material at the end of the day.
Jim Borden, I live on Sitters Pond Road. I'm just curious, so you've said eventually Surf Drive has to be abandoned, or did I say that correctly? And so what happens then? And because the houses, say, between Mill Road and Shore Street, there's a lot of homes in there, and there's not a lot of elevation. And so what's plan B after we hold things together for a period of time? I don't know if that's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. What happens then?
Yeah, thanks. And I think that thinking through that process is going to take more time. We looked mostly at the near-term adaptation of dune and beach restoration, but we are looking at the managed retreat and think that the priority is essentially from the Shining Sea Bikeway to Mills Ave. So the Bywater Court area and the homes behind that are less vulnerable to erosion. They are still vulnerable to flooding. Many of those homes are up on posts and all. But in terms of retreating that portion of Surf Drive between Mill and Shore Street is less of a priority. It's less of a risk. Does that answer your question? Or it doesn't fully, because you're saying someday we might have to abandon all of it. We don't know what that someday is, truly. I think really it will start to become more clear in time. I think with even abandoning from Shining Sea Bikeway to Mills Ave, that is a long-term prospect. That's going to take a major storm, something that would be too costly to reconstruct after. That does that, and we're going to be in a whole new paradigm essentially at that time.
Joe Netto, your presentation gives us more questions than answers. And a big part of this, when you talk, the town itself, to present this to its citizens, has got to come up with the other part of the problem that you're going to create if any part of the roadway is taken away. Main Street Falmouth would become a gridlock. Just go down Surf Drive in the wintertime and see the traffic that goes by there. I'm a resident of East Falmouth. The beach that I sat on, the road that I drove my bicycle to 70 years ago, is underwater. If you go to Minot Beach today and stand on that wooden bridge, you're at the edge of the ocean. There was a road there. And 70 years ago, I rode my bike there, and the beach was to the south. That's in Nantucket Sound today. You're not going to beat Mother Nature. She's going to win. But yet, in the same breath, this road that you're talking about is only part of the south-facing coast of the town of Falmouth. And we really, as a town, have to look at this from the Shining Sea bike path to Central Avenue. And that shore road is a major thoroughfare. So when you talk about ripping up asphalt, what's it going to cost to redo the sewer, to redo the water lines? So your report is what you were told to do. What I'm asking the town to do is you have to give us a lot more information for us if this came to town meeting, if this came to a ballot. I mean, this is so complex. I've done a lot of reading on this because when I sat there on that bridge one day and realized the road in my beach was gone. Now you just quickly mentioned groins. And a lot of reading I've done is that groins have caused this problem. These stone structures, from what I've read, that we thought solved the problem has actually created the problem. And it's interesting, and it's almost proven. In one of your slides, the beach by the Signing Sea Bikeway has groins, and the road's very narrow. I forget what you call it. Then when you go down by the moors where there's no groins, the beach is wider. So what in your report, and you just glanced over it, so what's your stand, what's your recommendation on what we should do with the groins that we own that are at Surf Drive, that are at, and we don't own all this land, that are at Minot Beach, that are at Falmouth Heights Beach, at Bristol Beach? Should we start taking those out? Because, yeah, Peter, I don't want to monopolize this, but there's so many questions.
You've raised two complex questions. Thank
Yeah.
you very much. So let's address both of those. So I'll start with your first question, or actually it wasn't a question. It was sort of a request.
Statement.
Yeah, that there are a lot of implications for abandoning the paved roadway beyond just driving down the road and the immediate homeowners. 100% correct. And this, as I said earlier, what this study is about and what tonight's meeting is about is not a final answer to Surf Drive. There is a lot of work to do. There are a lot of implications. We do have relocation of the sewer main, for example, on the capital plan. So that is, that has long been recognized as something that will need to happen at some point. Mike Renshaw, I don't know if you want to add anything further to that, or if that sort of. Okay. Data to make better informed decisions. So with that, I'll then let Connor answer the question on what's his stand on groins.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate your comment. I mean, you're right. This does create more questions than answers. I totally agree with you. To the groin question itself, those groins do not seem to be helping. We haven't studied that specifically in this project. We looked a little bit at longshore transport. That's what groins are meant to do, interrupt longshore transport. So sand that's moving from east to west gets interrupted by a groin. It deposits on the up coast side. There's erosion on the down coast side. This is just the process of longshore sediment transport and groins. If you removed the groins along Surf Drive, you could essentially destabilize what has become the norm. We've built our infrastructure there with the understanding of what the groins are doing and how the beach is. There would probably be several years of equilibration. I don't know if those groins are really doing much, though. I'm kind of with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, if traveling from Falmouth Harbor to Florida by boat, and you go by New Jersey, and it's a straight line, the coast of New Jersey, and there's no groins there. The state of Florida, very similar. One question I do have confused. You said you cannot do beach nourishment. So when does building a dune not become beach nourishment? If you could expound on that a little.
Yeah, thanks. That is a gray area for sure. We're more constrained by a buffer from the eelgrass. So beach nourishment can be small. It could be on the upper beach. There could just be a small project that spreads some sand in that upper beach and doesn't build a dune. That would be beach nourishment. But it would be so small scale that it would probably be negligible. Building a dune means building a hill, mound, or ridge at the edge of the ocean that is then planted with sediment and becomes dune habitat. So that's what we focused on because we felt that, one, you can get more volume by going higher, and two, you can reduce wave run-up and overtopping as a result of going higher. Does that answer your question?
Was there a 4A Did you at one point say that there could be one lane going one way? Do you know where on the roadway the utilities are?
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, alternative 4 is kind of the umbrella of phasing a retreat of some sort, but 4A is reducing it to one lane. And the utilities are unfortunately, the water main is on the seaward side. So there is going to have to be some work associated with that. But I think from the erosion standpoint, staying on the northern side of the road, keeping the northern side while abandoning the southern side would, put you further away from the hazard.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Paul Smith. We live on Mills Avenue, formerly known as Mill Road. Two quick points. One of the things that I've noticed on doing a very quick research, that there is some beaches that use a mesh, geotextile mesh or a more solid mesh to preserve the dunes. And then if you have not looked at that, that might be something to take a look at it between now and the report comes out. And the second thing is that on Mills Avenue, we've enjoyed the Eversource project for the last several years. And I'm pleased that they were able to build a parking lot quite a ways away from us on it. But if they're going to have to do further work, I think it would be appropriate for them to start to address this very question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So first I'll speak to the geotextile fabric used as a core for the dunes. That is something that has been constructed, you may be well aware of, on Nantucket. Those geotubes have been used. They are I don't know if you've ever knocked on one, they are very solid features. They essentially act similarly to a revetment in the way that they are just a solid wall placed at the toe of a dune or inside a dune or at the toe of a bank or something like that. So they are often wave reflecting of waves as well. There are other alternatives where people put sand inside more natural fiber materials like core fiber materials. This often occurs on coastal bank coastlines as opposed to in barrier beach or coastal dune. That material can erode away with time, so it holds the sediment for a little while until it decomposes, and then it releases that sediment to the near shore. Along this barrier beach, that's not exactly appropriate. That's not we're trying to replicate the resources which used to be there, as opposed to kind of bring in foreign materials that start to disrupt the natural process of things. But it is a good question. And then to your second question, I'm forgetting now, about Eversource. Thank you. Peter McConerty has put us in touch with Eversource, and you're right that there definitely needs to be a discussion between the two groups. Eversource has a lot of investment at the edge of Surf Drive here. The energy lines that go to Martha's Vineyard go right underneath Surf Drive, so there's a lot of coordination that needs to go on with them.
Yeah, that was really a great presentation. I'm curious, all of your modeling showed significant loss of sand for each storm, and I'm just curious where the sand went, and also whether the model included a longshore transport.
Yeah, great question. So we only modeled cross-shore transport, which is sediment moving inland or offshore. We did not model longshore transport. There has been a little bit of assessment of what is occurring in the longshore, but because we're doing a dune project, those dunes are not working with the daily tide and they're not moving with those longshore currents, so that became less of a priority to look at the longshore as opposed to the cross-shore. Now, where does the sand go in the cross-shore modeling? In most cases, the models seem to push the sand inland. So this is a very typical process of barrier beaches, again, especially in response to sea level rise. A natural beach here is trying to find equilibrium, again, with the ocean. And the ocean is becoming more energetic and it's raising in water level. And so the beach, as a response, wants to move inland and it wants to move upland to essentially absorb that energy. So most of the sand is overwashing into essentially salt pond or oyster pond, fresh river, et cetera.
how much public-private land is involved in this project from the Shining Sea to Paul, you live on Mill Ave now? to the Surf Drive bathhouse. Obviously, the Surf Drive bathhouse belongs to the town. And do you have the permission of the private landowners to do these projects?
Yeah, thank you. This is definitely a mixed ownership. There are probably about a couple dozen private parcels along this reach. We just before this meeting at 5 p.m. had a property owners meeting. That was the second of two. So we are engaging directly with property owners, knowing that this will most directly affect them. I'm happy to take any question, even the most outrageous question. Any question, even the hardest, please.
Oh, that's a good point. Okay, so here's a question. How does the repair of Fresh River Culvert fit into these plans and timeline?
All right, I may have to shirk this one and pass it to Peter McConerty. But yes, Fresh River Culvert, often sand is depositing in that river and needs to be dredged and maintained. That's actually a part of the targeted improvements that I didn't touch on maybe even at all. So I'll go back to it for a second. There are 3 inlets to Oyster Pond. So we have Trunk River down here in the southwest. There's the inlet to Salt Pond, and then there's the inlet to Fresh River. And these are protected by long jetties, very similar to the groins in the way that they're meant to stop sand from moving horizontally along the beach and entering those inlets to keep them open. But still, sand is able to get around the corner or go through the cracks and holes in the revetments in the rock themselves and fill into Salt Pond and Fresh River, and so dredging needs to take place. That sand is coming from Surf Drive. So the goal is to reuse that sediment beneficially to put on the beach for one, but if a dune restoration project occurs, it can be used as material to help maintain those projects and fix holes that might be developing over time. Peter, do you want to talk about the culvert?
Peter McConerty, Director of Public Works. As you can see, I'm very conflicted by this whole process. It kind of being Public Works and in charge of infrastructure throughout the town, I'm conflicted with the whole process. But with the culverts, I did have conversations. Salt Pond, we reconstructed that last year. We are currently in the process, and Eversource contributed some funds to replace the Fresh River culvert, so we're also going to be working on that. Those are areas that we will have to somehow work with to have them maintained so we can still maintain those, so when the water goes into either Salt Pond or Oyster Pond or Fresh River, that we'll be able to keep those pathways open so the water can come back out. So that would be part of the design of the, when we started working with the design of how this would all work. Obviously, right now, that Public Works does maintain all 3 of those culverts at this point in time. So that's something that we'd have to work with as this process moves forward.
Thank you, Peter. So another question we have from one of our Zoom viewers. Is there a way to enhance the growth of the offshore dune grass? I think they mean eelgrass, offshore dune grass, so that an enhanced root system could lessen the future impacts of storm erosion?
All right, so I can take that question in both directions it could have gone. The offshore grass is providing great stability to the beach. Even our modeling itself, we did a model with the eelgrass present and we did a model without the eelgrass present. When the eelgrass was not present, there was much more erosion. These projects did not stand up to nearly the waves that we threw at them. Planting eelgrass and preserving it is a tough thing to do. I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that it's been attempted in the state of Massachusetts, but it has been rarely successful. So that's something that is more preserve what you have as opposed to attempt to go artificially create more. And then in terms of dune grass, beach grass on the dune, works similarly. Again, it's vegetation. The root systems are helping to hold the sediments in place. And so there are practices that private landowners can do to help increase the resiliency of their properties and their beaches. Planting and protecting vegetation such as beach grass will help to stabilize your coast. It will help to reduce the energy that is rushing up over the dunes.
So we do have a couple more questions from the folks on Zoom. Would it be possible to manage a one-lane surf drive in a manner so that two-way traffic controlled by traffic lights could be implemented during the majority of the year, and a one-way traffic pattern could be implemented during the summer months? What other streets would have got absorbed or would absorb the increase in traffic? Peter, I think I'm going to hand that one to you.
So I think what we're talking about is removing the utilities from Surf Drive, so we wouldn't want to be installing traffic signals or putting conduits under the roadway if we're going to be looking at that. There could be options of one way at certain times, but I think one way would either be in the westerly direction or the easterly direction.
Thank you, Peter. Next question, could Surf Drive be elevated and built up with sand below?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Something that was looked at in the Coastal Resiliency Report is, well, why don't we just keep elevating Surf Drive and above the sea level rise and the storm level? Well, the sand that is fronting it continues to be vulnerable to erosion. And so you may be able to build the roadway up on another, compacted earth or soil or sand, but you are only going to be increasing your risk to undermining. So if you put your road up higher, and again, that erosion comes, that storm comes and wants to wash out the dune, instead of your roadway dropping by 6 inches or a foot, your roadway could drop by 5 feet or so if you try to build higher and higher and build a wall of sand. A wall of road.
Lynn Shad, to that point, could you put it on pilings? Like there's lots of bridges that go over much greater spans and deeper bodies of water. So could it be something like that? Obviously expensive.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Feasibly, you could put it on pilings, and you could build 1.5 miles of road that is lifted off the sediment. Those piles would have to go very deep. But I think what you would have with trends of erosion and sea level rise is a road that is increasingly sitting over the ocean while your beach starts to move inland away from you. So yes, you could do it. It would be expensive. And now you have a bridge over the open ocean as opposed to, but it's an interesting thought. So thank you.
Hi. Is this on? Yeah, Leslie Fields, Woods Hole Group. I just wanted you to talk about the thing we talked about in the previous meeting. Since there are a number of privately owned properties here, what if, like, the town uses public dollars to build a dune along some of these private properties? What sorts of permissions do they have to give, or easements, or something like that?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. So Leslie's bringing up the point of how do we fund something like this? Typically, these projects are too high for a municipal capital cost, and they search for grant funds from the state or federal agencies. If we went for state grant funds to nourish these beaches and that took place on top of private property, there would necessarily be easements that the property owners would need to agree with. So this project could not go forward on those private properties if property owners did not agree with them. Additionally, in addition to the easements, what would be baked into those easements would be, to some degree, public access. Now, public access is a right in Massachusetts along the intertidal zone. This would be essentially furthering that right by saying that people could horizontally access the shoreline in the area of where public funds were used to benefit the beach. That doesn't mean that they could go across the beach and they could walk underneath your house if it's on piles, or walk through your driveway and get to the beach. There's not now 1,000 public access ways to the beach, but by going through a public beach to a beach that was nourished with public funds, that has an easement, they could then legally move horizontally up and down the beach.
Hi, I'm Mary Connolly. I live in Falmouth. Thank you so much for doing this. And I understand you're still working on this report. What is just the general timeline on when the town thinks it might come to a decision on which plan to use?
Yeah, in all honesty, we don't have a firm timeline on that. I think this will be the third study. We started with the vulnerability planning, and then the first surf drive study and this feasibility. So, I think over the course of the next year, the town is going to begin to have those conversations about which of these alternatives do we want to pursue, and as Connor touched on in his presentation, what are the triggers going to be for when we implement those solutions. And then, of course, a part of that planning process is what are the grants available and what are those grant timelines. So, that's all. Those are all factors that we're going to be looking at over the course of the next year, but we do not have a predetermined timeline for implementation at this point.
Again, Eileen Gunn, East Falmouth. I have a question about this strategy. A comment, but also a question for CZM while they're here about permitting. So even if we were to make a decision tonight on an alternative, it could be at best 5 or 6 years before anything began to be constructed. By the time you get the funding, do the final design, get the permits, do the public engagement. So I have a feeling and a fear that a decision like this is going to be forced upon us sooner rather than later, and we have been studying this for a very long time. So, I really think that this should be part of like a hazard mitigation response where we know if this gets, especially this segment here along Morris Beach, gets destroyed in a hurricane, like the town makes a decision either through a town vote or something that they are going to go to the one-lane reconstruction at that point. There needs to be a series of actions and decisions maybe that the town votes on in some capacity. But I think that needs to happen sooner rather than later in case we do get another Hurricane Bob. And then my question for CZM is, the permitting of any of these are pretty epic. So is there a alternative that CZM would like to see in terms of protecting the natural resource here? Something that is more permittable than, is everything here permittable in your view?
Hi, Rebecca Haney with CZM. So I can't speak to what every agency would say is permittable. We've been trying to make sure that there's engagement with the permitting agencies and guiding the town as much as possible, but we can't guarantee that everything would be permittable. However, a dune nourishment, like what we're talking about, requires a lot fewer permits. So it's primarily an order of conditions and filing under the Mass Endangered Species Act. If you stay above the annual high tide line, then there's a lot fewer permits. So much shorter period of time, relatively speaking. Reducing a lane as well. It depends on the overall scale of the project. There can be, if you're getting public funds, you can trip possibly a MEPA filing with the Mass Environmental Policy Act, but just a dune nourishment may be under that. So, but the public funding can be a trigger, and the extent of it, but the reducing a lane wouldn't necessarily be any additional. It's not a DOT road, so you're not triggering any additional state permits at that point. So if beach nourishment would have triggered many more permits because you trip a lot more jurisdictions.
I have one more question from the Zoom that I want to get to, and then we'll return to questions from the audience. Would it be correct to say that if we select alternative 2, $3 million, and there are 2 5-year storms, we will spend as much as if we had selected alternative 4A from the outset.
I think they did the math correctly.
Dr. Schneider.
Barb Schneider from the Beach Committee. I want to start by saying thank you to the members of the Beach Committee who have been working on this kind of thing and raising awareness about it for the last 4 years and pushing hard to get a coastal resiliency person on board. And Josh, it's more obvious tonight how much we needed you 4 years ago. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you a lot in the next year. I want to just say that one thing to keep in mind is that Governor Healy, around the 20th of May, announced that because there are 3 million people in Massachusetts alone that are impacted by what's happening with sea level rise and climate change and flooding, she has suggested a plan called the Resilient Coasts Initiative that you should all keep your eye on, because it's in the planning stages and it's in the input stage, but it includes things like voluntary buyout for people who are in flood areas and shoring up transportation areas to get out of areas. And I think it's something that we all should be watching and noticing. Thank you.
I just was going to say thank you, Barb, and also thank you to the Beach Committee, because they were instrumental in getting this project off the ground and funded with CZM.
Couple more questions online. Has any coastal town anywhere with an analogous challenge to Surf Drive divined a solution?
Well, the example I gave with a retreat project was in Situate, which is my hometown, Peggotty Beach. So the solution there was honestly working with nature. So they have done a level of retreat. They have pulled back their road away from the ocean. They've moved it onto the landward side of many of those homes. They've turned it into an oversand vehicle access road. They have also taken part in dune restoration activities. So they have brought in sand. They have planted that sand with beach grass. Other places are having a big struggle. So there are many barrier beaches across Massachusetts. Again, there's Westport, which I've mentioned, but there's also Hull. There is Duxbury Beach Reservation. There are areas in the North Shore and the Great Marsh. Duxbury Beach Reservation is one example of an area where they have, for over a decade, been very intentionally managing their beaches to preserve them in the long term. They have been planning each reach in various different ways, identifying areas where they need beach nourishment, areas where they need dune restoration. They've been looking at the backside of their barrier where they can do projects like a cobble berm. They've been trying to shore up areas that have bridges connected to them. And so that is one area where they have been managing their assets for a long time and to some success. So they have successfully gotten funds from Coastal Zone Management Office, for one, and other funds as well, to bring in material to pay for this high cost of sand and to maintain their beaches. Oh, and we have one comment here.
So lessons learned in terms of how other communities are dealing with this, the more you work with nature, the more effective it is. Even the Army Corps of Engineers, in their analysis after Hurricane Sandy, found that the more nature-based solutions were more effective. The structural solutions had a lot more problems in those storms, and we're already seeing those issues here in Massachusetts, but we haven't, thankfully, had a Hurricane Sandy. So it's one of those things to keep in mind, is that the structural solutions have a lot more challenges. So we do have plenty of examples from other communities that we can help provide to as resources and as recommendations in terms of the kinds of things that you can do. And it is site-specific. So that's the reason for doing this study, is to make sure that the recommendations are site-specific for you.
think this is the last online question we have at this point. Are you still using the 2.3 foot sea level rise by 2030 basis for these projections?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. For our modeling that we showed with cross-shore changes, these are no sea level rise scenario. These are existing conditions. So we did not look at 2.5 feet of sea level rise. Sea level rise and accelerating sea level rise will dramatically worsen these. They may turn what is a 20%, 20-year, I don't have, we modeled, I'm sorry, I was mixing this up in my brain. We modeled several different storm events. We modeled a 2-year storm. We modeled this as the 5-year storm. We also modeled that 20-year storm. So with sea level rise, a 20-year storm may become a 5-year storm, and a 5-year storm may become a 2-year storm. Those are expected to get worse. But because this dune is really a temporary solution, a near-term solution, sea level rise was not in this.
Just so I understand this correctly, so if any one of those alternatives, are they only going to buy us one 5-year storm?
I think the way that a storm actually plays out on the coastline is it can really vary across the entire beach. So the Trunk River is facing one direction while the public beach is facing a slightly different direction. We have groins that may disrupt wave energy or may accentuate wave energy. I think each part of the beach may respond differently, and this result is unlikely to be a blanket result for the 1.5 miles. I think this should be taken with a grain of salt as that these results are worst case. This is what could happen. It could happen at any point along the beach. But I don't think in one foul swoop, unless it were a major hurricane, that the whole of the project area is going to be washed away. Does that make sense? Or please go ahead.
And just one other question. We've been suggesting that the bathhouse needs to be relocated because of sea level rise and storms. But this, what you've presented here tonight, goes from the Shining Sea bike path to Mill Road. So does that mean the bathhouse is safe for a 10-year storm or longer, or?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So we only focused on one reach here. Those model results are really showing this transect where the beach is narrow, the road is low. We did model 4 transects in total, so there's a modeling of reach D, which will, it faces a different direction, experiences waves a little bit differently. We did model specifically the dune area, so the results aren't exactly applicable to the Mitchell bathhouse, but they are very helpful there. So the bathhouse, if we zoomed in, is essentially the edge of the bathhouse is at the same location as the toe of the dune. And in our modeling of transect D, that dune is getting scoured and scoured and scoured by storms. It does hold up better. I have said that the public beach is more resilient than the Moores Beach reach, but it doesn't mean that it's not at risk to erosion and doesn't need to be maintained in the long term. So Mitchell Bathhouse is very vulnerable. I would say in the report you'll see the 2-year storm, the 5-year storm, and the 20-year storm. I can't recall exactly which one starts to undermine where we would expect the bathhouse to be, but it's at a minimum the 20-year, probably the 5-year, where it could be undermined.
Hi, Robin Sates. I'm on Leslie Street in Woods Hole. Great study. Gives us a lot of good information. I'm just curious, does this kick off a long-term project? Like looking at the long-term view of what Falmouth will do because it's going to happen?
Right. So you're asking, are we going to be looking at other areas of town?
Other areas of town, but even just this whole area, like long-term, because nature's going to win. So I'm curious what the town is doing to look beyond these very temporary solutions.
Right. So absolutely, that process, as I alluded to earlier, began with a vulnerability assessment of the whole town, and the study that preceded this one for Surf Drive, looked at a wider array of solutions. So, absolutely, this is just the beginning. This is going to be an ongoing process, for the remainder of this community's existence. So there's a lot more work to be done, for sure.
Emily Ferguson, I live in North Falmouth. If we were to cut and run, basically just eliminate Surf Drive as a road and allow the whole barrier beach to dump into Salt Pond and fill in the way it's ultimately going to, and save ourselves $6 million in the short term. How advanced is the town's planning for what the transportation and utilities are going to look like once we have to have no choice but to get rid of all of this? Are we at a crossroads where we could decide to just stop messing with the barrier beach and let nature take its course and invest the money in the way we're going to have to reroute traffic and utilities through town? Because obviously we're going to have to do something about the Woods Hole Road and the pressure on the back road, and, you know, we can all see that coming.
Great question. So what I would say is we're a little further along in terms of relocating the sewer line, which is on the capital plan for, I think, 2 or 3 years down the road. We are just beginning, I believe, to look at relocation of the water service to Woods Hole that is vulnerable along Surf Drive. Peter, I don't know if you have anything to add to that in terms of the transportation planning?
Yeah, so on the water portion of it, we have our on-call consultant has a hydraulic study for the whole water system in Falmouth. So we're working with our consultant right now is swinging valves. You shut this valve off at Oyster Pond, you shut the valve off at Mill Road. What happens when the system, with the system? What we want to avoid with the water is we don't want one-way systems. We try to do dual loops. And when you start swinging valves and having the water go a different direction, what does that do with to the interior of the pipes and to the water quality? So those are things that we're looking at right now. It all can be overcome. I think it's less of a process with the water than it would be for the wastewater, so that's not something we have to worry about. As far as traffic, I'll tell you what, not down in this area, but in the area over in East Falmouth, I had folks tell me that, you know, the amount of vehicles that go down this road because they don't want to go through downtown Falmouth because of the traffic jams. I didn't believe it until I got stuck in it coming back from East Falmouth, from Central Ave, coming through East Falmouth. It is a major route, and it does get used by people going to Woods Hole. It gets used by people coming to either going using Elm Street or Oyster Pond. So that is something that's going to have to be looked at. But as this moves forward, when the options do become, you know, limited of what we can do, we're going to need to look at that as far as the traffic. We're going to need to look at that, and then a decision's going to have to be made on that.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to add one thing to that's a great question, and we recognize how big of a problem it is to actually retreat from the roadway. And one thing that this project was a result of this project that wasn't necessarily expected was the number of constraints that we had on developing nature-based solutions for protection. So we were, kind of came into this with wider eyes, thinking, oh, maybe we'll, buy ourselves a solid amount of time, and planning retreat will be further in the future than. But the result of the study is really what's now tipping us into the managed retreat discussion sooner than maybe we had expected originally. And we even had pivoted some of this project that we're working on more towards that, and there's going to be a small memo component to this project that is at least starting to bring up the discussion of all the different components, from the sewer main to the water main to the uses on Surf Drive, to the traffic flow.
Okay, well, I think we'll take one more question, and then we will wrap it up.
This wasn't a question, it's an anecdote. I'm Pat Keon, I'm from Falmouth. I walked down the Surf Drive maybe an hour after Hurricane Bob, and it had picked up the macadam and left it in the grass. Everything was gone, and I knew from that day, I mean, driving that road is my joy, and I knew it's going to go away someday. My fear is that I will have to always use living off of Woods Hill Road. I will have to be in ferry traffic all my life, and I don't think I could stand it. So that would have to be something to think about.
Well, thank you all very much for coming and for your great questions, and there's a lot more to come on this issue. So keep the questions and ideas coming.